The stage was bathed in soft morning light, the kind that made everything look glossy and harmless. The View's audience clapped and whistled as Meghan Markle walked onto the set in a crisp white suit. Her hair pinned perfectly, her smile controlled, but warm. It had been a year since her last major media appearance, and this was meant to be her return, elegant, rebranded, and well-timed. The producers had promised a gentle conversation, something about motherhood, charity work, and how she'd found peace after the royal storm. But from the moment she sat down, something felt off. The usual warmth of the panel had been replaced with a stiff, silent electricity. Joy Behar was smiling too much. Whoopi Goldberg kept checking her cue cards. Even Sunny and Alyssa looked more nervous than usual. Meghan noticed it, but she brushed it off. She was trained for this. Or at least she thought she was. The first 10 minutes passed smoothly. Joy complimented Meghan's latest book. Sunny praised her recent work in Nigeria. There were laughs, nods, applause. But then Joy leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk. Her voice dropped, still playful, but with a sharp edge. "So, Meghan," she said, "after everything Netflix, Spotify, the palace, the podcasts, do you ever get the feeling that maybe, just maybe, people are tired of hearing about it?" The audience laughed, unsure whether it was a joke or a jab. Meghan blinked, unsure herself. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, another voice joined in. "Or," said Stephen Colbert, stepping onto the stage from backstage, "maybe people are just starting to ask the right questions." There was confusion and applause. Meghan's head turned sharply. She hadn't been told Stephen would be joining. The producers hadn't mentioned it. And the way he walked onto the set with that calm smile and folded hands told her he wasn't here for jokes. Stephen Colbert. "Everyone," Joy said quickly, trying to keep the mood light. "Host of The Late Show? Friend of the table. He's got thoughts." Stephen sat down opposite Meghan. The smile on his face faded slightly as he looked her directly in the eyes. "I actually do," he said. "Few thoughts. Especially about Geneva. You remember Geneva, don't you?" The room froze. The audience stopped clapping. The producers behind the cameras went pale. Meghan's breath caught. She didn't answer right away. Stephen continued. "You were there in 2019, right? UN building, closed session. Not as Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, but under a different name. I think the diplomatic code was M.M. Stroud. Want to tell us about that?" Joy's mouth opened slightly. Alyssa looked like she had been kicked. Whoopi leaned back slowly, silent. Meghan didn't blink. Her face went still. Her fingers pressed against each other tightly in her lap. "It's not public information," she said softly, "but it's true." Stephen asked again, his voice now serious, not even pretending to be funny. "You were there at a secret meeting involving several African leaders and British intelligence officials. You spoke on behalf of your humanitarian foundation. The records show something else." "I think you're confusing stories," Meghan replied, trying to steady her voice. "My work in Geneva was—" "There's no public record of your presence that day," Stephen interrupted. "No media coverage, no transcripts. And yet a leaked memo from MI6 references your alias and suggests your presence helped secure surveillance infrastructure contracts under humanitarian disguise." A few audience members gasped. The others sat in shocked silence. Cameras kept rolling. The control room didn't cut to commercial. They were frozen too. Meghan looked down. Briefly. Her face was flushed, but she didn't speak. For the first time since stepping into the public arena, she seemed truly blindsided. She looked up at Stephen, her voice breaking slightly. "Where did you get that name?" Stephen's eyes didn't move. Let's just say not everyone in that room stayed loyal to the mission. Meghan turned to Joy. Was this planned?" Joy looked away. "We just asked questions, Meghan." The moment shattered whatever illusion had been built for this interview. Meghan took a slow breath, then leaned back in her chair, lips pressed tight. She knew anything she said now would spin out of control. Her silence, though, was worse. It was an answer by itself. Within minutes of the segment airing, the clip went viral. Stephen confronts Meghan trended globally. News outlets picked up the story mid-broadcast. TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, everyone had a take. Speculation exploded. What was Geneva? Who was Stroud? Was Meghan a diplomatic proxy? In London, royal advisors scrambled. A quiet meeting was called at the Foreign Office. Phones buzzed in Buckingham Palace. A junior aide who had worked on the Geneva brief was called in for questioning. Behind the curtain of tradition, panic set in. Someone had talked. Someone had let the truth slip. Back in New York, Meghan sat in silence inside her dressing room. The applause was long gone. Outside the door, security agents murmured. She stared at her reflection for a long time. The joke was supposed to be about her media fatigue. Now it was a war, and the world was watching. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, every major news outlet had clipped and dissected the segment. CNN ran it in rotation under a red ticker that read, "What was Meghan doing in Geneva?" BBC. Analysts debated the legitimacy of Stephen Colbert's claim, while Sky News brought in body language experts to analyze. Meghan's reaction frame by frame. On social media, hashtags trended globally #GenevaGate, #MMSROUD, #royally exposed. Some laughed, others speculated, but most watched in stunned silence as what began as a television segment transformed into a geopolitical event. Meghan Markle had not denied the accusation. She hadn't confirmed it either. But in a world fueled by perception, her silence had already spoken volumes. At the British Foreign Office, Edward Langston stood at the edge of a glass-walled briefing room, a mid-level MI6 liaison once tasked with soft diplomacy in Africa. Edward was no stranger to international cleanups. But this was a category he hadn't prepared for. The Prime Minister's special counsel paced behind him, barking orders into 3 separate phones. A folder stamped Operation Halcyon sat open on the table. A redacted line at the bottom read, Stroud authorized entry, May 3, 2019. She wasn't meant to be mentioned, let alone exposed. The counsel snapped, gesturing toward the folder. We had an agreement. That summit was sealed. Who leaked this? Edward didn't answer. He was too busy watching the clip again on his phone. Colbert's tone hadn't been playful, it had been deliberate. Someone fed him that information, and whoever it was, they knew exactly which wound to cut open. Fly to D.C. tonight, the counsel said. Meet with the Americans. Damage control begins now, and for God's sake, find out how deep this goes. In New York, Meghan was in hiding. Her PR team issued a brief statement claiming the segment had been ambushed, that Stephen's remarks were reckless. But Meghan herself didn't speak. Not to reporters, not to her foundation, not even to her closest staff. She had canceled all appearances, shuttered her social media, and turned off her phone. She stayed at a secure private residence outside Manhattan, guarded by private security and advised by former royal intelligence aides. The walls were lined with screens. Every one of them played the same story on a loop. She sat in the dark, drinking tea that had long gone cold. Her thoughts raced. Geneva. That meeting. She hadn't used the name Stroud in years. It was a ghost identity, one that had been created for a very specific purpose, to sit quietly among diplomats and give humanitarian legitimacy to a covert agreement between 3 nations. She hadn't signed anything. She hadn't spoken more than a few words. But she had been there. She had worn the mask, and now that mask had cracked in front of the entire world. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral. Mark, her head of security, stepped in quietly. Someone's here to see you, he said. Langston. Meghan froze. Edward. Mark nodded, says he was sent by the Crown. Says it's urgent. She stood slowly, pressing her fingers against the table to steady herself. Let him in, but check him for a wire first. Minutes later, Edward entered the room. His suit was wrinkled from travel. He looked older than she remembered, but the look in his eyes hadn't changed. It was that same cold steel behind the charm, the look of a man who'd buried truths for a living. "They want you silent," he said without preamble. "They're preparing a narrative." Meghan didn't flinch. "So am I." He sat across from her, uninvited. "If you speak publicly about Geneva, they'll frame you. You'll be accused of espionage. They'll say you used your royal status to gain access to classified meetings and then leak them for personal gain. The media will eat it alive." She stared at him. "Then why are you here?" "'Cause I don't think this is about Geneva." "Any more?" Edward said. "It's bigger. Colbert's not just speculating. He's reading from documents and not just the leaked memo. Something deeper. Something encrypted." Meghan narrowed her eyes. "Are you saying Colbert was part of Halcyon?" Edward hesitated. "No, I'm saying Colbert was briefed, which means someone from inside wants this out. Possibly someone from the Geneva delegation. Possibly someone with ties to the African bloc." Meghan sat back, her thoughts colliding. Halcyon hadn't just been about surveillance. It had been about resource access trade deals, rare earth minerals, digital rights in exchange for humanitarian PR. She'd played her part because she believed it was for the greater good. But if the documents leaked, they wouldn't show noble intentions. Rain fell in heavy sheets over Geneva as the city buzzed with unusual tension. The Palais des Nations, normally a fortress of quiet diplomacy and symbolic posturing, had become the center of a storm the United Nations hadn't prepared for. Inside, a private chamber shielded from journalists and cameras, a closed-door emergency session was underway. A dozen international delegates reviewed encrypted documents that had arrived anonymously 2 nights earlier, files that confirmed the existence of a secret diplomatic session in May 2019. The name Stroud appeared 7 times across, for pages, each instance linked to Meghan Markle's known humanitarian engagements, but the content underneath revealed more. Surveillance export approvals, biometric data testing in post-conflict zones, an authorization for a pilot program, Halcyon, Meghan's coded involvement wasn't just real. It was undeniable. Back in New York, Stephen Colbert sat alone in his dressing room, staring at the wall as a producer knocked softly and entered. "You've got the White House Correspondents' Dinner in an hour," she said. Stephen didn't look up. "Cancel my monologue." She blinked. "Excuse me? I'm not joking tonight," he said simply. "I'm not performing anymore." His staff didn't understand it. Audiences didn't either. But Colbert had never gone rogue without purpose. The clip from The View had been a calculated strike, not a comedic aside. What no one knew yet was that he had been handed that question 2 days before the show aired. A plain envelope, a return address. Inside, photocopied documents marked UK eyes only, and an audio transcript labeled Halcyon Summit, Geneva. Unofficial minutes. Meghan's voice featured in it, cautious but clear, saying, "Our presence here must remain diplomatic in narrative, even if not in function." He hadn't gone public for ratings. He'd gone public because someone wanted this out and trusted only him to do it. Meanwhile, in a private compound in upstate New York, Meghan Markle was reviewing a flash drive that Edward Langston had handed her with trembling fingers. The data inside was staggering communications between MI6 agents and private sector surveillance developers. Its contracts masked as humanitarian supply routes, and most damning of all, a photograph of Meghan seated at a long wooden table surrounded by men in military uniforms and 3 African ministers. Her face wasn't turned to the camera, but it was her. It was unmistakable. She leaned back in her chair, fighting the rising nausea. "They never told me what the room was about," she whispered. "They said it was about water access and disease mapping. They said I was there for image support. Edward said nothing. He knew better than to feed her comfort. She looked at him sharply. Was this a setup from the beginning? "I think you were a useful cover," he said finally. "And now you're a loose end." The silence between them was interrupted by a message on Meghan's encrypted tablet. It was from an unknown sender. It's just a short line. "Do not trust Edward. Halcyon has a second phase." Meghan's heart pounded. She looked up slowly. Edward raised an eyebrow, noticing her sudden shift in posture. She forced a smile. "You should go." He studied her. "You'll need protection. They won't stop." "Now I've got it," she lied. Edward stood, adjusted his jacket, and nodded. "Then God help you." After he left, Meghan immediately sent the flash drive to 3 trusted journalists, Lena Baines, Maria Vasquez, and a rising Swiss reporter named Emile Thorne. Each had covered human rights stories that had crossed diplomatic red lines. If they published, it would force governments to react publicly. But it would also mark her as a primary source, an act that could easily be spun as treason. Elsewhere, Lena Baines received the file and recognized immediately what she held. She called her editor. "We don't run this in a newspaper." She said, "We run this in The Hague, within hours." Lena boarded a red-eye flight to Geneva with her team. At the same time, UN officials began scrubbing internal databases that showed guest logins and diplomatic access IDs from the 2019 summit. One name had already disappeared, Dem M. Stroud. But someone, somewhere, had preserved it. Someone wanted. This remembered that night, Stephen Colbert took the stage in a black suit. Facing a ballroom of dignitaries and reporters expecting laughter, he skipped the jokes. Instead, he looked directly into the camera and said, "We've joked for years. That power hides behind comedy. But today, comedy had to uncover it." The audience sat in stunned silence as he described the Halcyon documents, the shadow diplomacy, the lies sold as charity. He didn't name Meghan, but the room already knew. Across the world, that speech was watched by 48 million people in the first 6 hours. It was no longer about an actress, was no longer about a prince's wife. It was about something darker, a system built in silence and designed to erase accountability. And now, for the first time, that system had a name. The streets of Geneva were quieter than usual, but tension hummed just beneath the cobblestone. Inside a secure UN chamber, Lena Baines stood at the front of the room, facing a panel of investigators assembled for an emergency ethics inquiry. Her voice echoed through the wood-paneled chamber, sharp and unflinching, as she delivered a summary of the Halcyon data. The documents on the screen behind her painted a damning picture. Memorandums between British and American intelligence contractors, forged humanitarian contracts, signed export authorizations, and a chain of encrypted approvals that tied directly to the biometric scanning of rural populations in politically unstable nations. At the center of one document was a signature. M. Stroud, Meghan Markle's covert identity. "This," Lena said as she gestured to the data, "isn't a leak. It's a confession someone else didn't want to write." The room remained silent. Cameras had been banned from the session, but every delegate present knew that the contents of the hearing would leak eventually. The weight of the scandal was too much to contain. A former British royal tied to a covert international surveillance network. The implications were catastrophic. Outside the chamber, security was doubled. Protesters had begun gathering again, holding signs that read "Humanitarian. Lies in surveillance isn't peace." Some carried photos of Meghan with her eyes blacked out. Others carried images of Stephen Colbert next to the word "whistle clown." The public didn't know who to believe anymore. Back in the U.S., Meghan was in hiding again, this time in a safe house arranged through back channels by a member of the African Union delegation. Her phone was disconnected from all networks. But she still received printed updates, headlines, online commentary, death threats. One headline stood out. "Markle may face war crimes inquiry." It was from a tabloid, but the language was spreading into more credible sources. Meghan threw the paper across the room. Across the table sat Maria Vasquez, silently reading a new transcript she'd received from her contact inside the UN. "They're not charging you," she said. "Not yet. But they've asked for you to testify." Meghan's hands trembled. As what? A witness? Or a suspect? Maria didn't answer. Instead, she slid an envelope toward her. Inside were photos. Not from Geneva, but from a sealed British military facility outside of Accra, Ghana. In them, a younger Meghan could be seen speaking with a pair of diplomats and someone wearing a Royal Army patch. The file was labeled Key Tem K2, Covert PR Operations, and the date was 2 years before she had ever joined the royal family. Where did this come from? Meghan asked, almost in a whisper. "Someone's digging into your history far before the palace," Maria said. "There's a version of you the public never saw. The version someone trained for this kind of work." Meghan stood abruptly. "That's not who I am." Maria was calm. "Then you'd better prove it. Fast." In London, Parliament was under siege not physically, but politically. The Prime Minister's approval ratings had plummeted. Several MPs from the ruling party called for an independent inquiry. Mi-6's involvement was now undeniable, and whispers inside the intelligence community suggested this scandal was just the beginning. The Halcyon files were correct. At least 6 other public figures, 3 politicians, 2 journalists, and a world-famous tech philanthropist had ties to similar covert summits in Nairobi, Berlin, and Sao Paulo. Meghan had become the symbol, but the operation had been vast. Meanwhile, Stephen Colbert was under federal review in Washington. The Senate's Intelligence Committee requested a closed-door interview after his televised monologue went viral. Colbert agreed, but only on one condition: that the source of the documents remain protected. What he didn't say aloud was that he no longer knew who was feeding him intel. Every day, a new envelope arrived. No fingerprints, no clues, only more truth. That afternoon, while Meghan paced the cold marble floor of the safe house, she received an untraceable audio file delivered. By courier, she inserted the drive into a locked tablet. The recording was rough, laced with static, but the voice was unmistakable. It was her own. "We have to ensure plausible deniability. This falls apart. I need the option to claim ignorance." Another voice answered. "We've erased the secondary identities. But your image is still on file in Geneva and Nairobi. I want those gone. I'll take care of it." Meghan's face drained of color. She didn't remember saying those words, but it was her voice. The timestamp matched the Geneva summit. She looked at Maria, shaking. "That wasn't me. I don't remember saying that." Maria's expression didn't change. The air inside the UN press theater was tight with anticipation, as if the walls themselves could sense that what was coming would not just be a statement, it would be a reckoning. Meghan Markle, for the first time in weeks, was set to speak. Live, not through aides, not in filtered sound bites, not in controlled studio segments, but in her own voice. Streamed to the world from an undisclosed location arranged by an independent international media council. The event had been branded simply The Testimony. Over 400 reporters had applied for access. Only 12 were selected. Maria Vasquez was one of them. The broadcast began with no fanfare, no music, no dramatic intro. Just the cold, clinical hum of an encrypted satellite feed and the image of Meghan sitting before a gray wall, her face bare, her voice calm but distant. "I am not here today as a duchess," she began, "and I am not here to defend a throne or a title or a legacy. I am here because silence is no longer survival." She paused, just long enough for the weight to sink in. "For years, I believed I was doing good, that humanitarian work could speak louder than politics. But in 2019, I walked into a room in Geneva thinking I was there to help draft a global maternal health initiative. What I found was a network of power brokers dressed as diplomats. And I didn't walk out. I stayed. I smiled. I gave the moment credibility." The confession rippled across screens from Washington to Nairobi. Anchors fumbled to interpret it in real time. In Buckingham Palace, royal advisors huddled behind closed doors, fingers pressed to their lips, phones vibrating on every table, Meghan continued. I used the name M.M. Stroud because I was told it was temporary, for protection. But what I didn't realize was that name came with another purpose. It made me deniable. If things went wrong, the royals could say they didn't send me. The government could say I acted independently, and I wouldn't have the power to prove otherwise. Maria Vasquez scribbled furiously. But it wasn't the words Meghan said that struck her, it was the way she said them. Not as a woman cornered, but as a woman unraveling her own story in real time. Holding the thread up to the light and seeing the dust she had ignored for years. The Halcyon documents, Meghan said, some of them are real, some are altered. And some are missing pieces I can't give you because I was never meant to see the full picture. I was a face, a shield, symbol used to make surveillance look like compassion. She blinked slowly, hands folded in front of her. And I let them. At that moment, a flashing alert appeared on news channels worldwide. Grey Ribbon, the hacker collective, had just released another file dump, this time 8,000 internal communications between UK and US intelligence agencies. Among them, a 2018 memo suggesting that Meghan was being monitored even before her engagement to Prince Harry. It wasn't just about her participating in Halcyon, it was about recruiting her. Meanwhile, Stephen Colbert was watching the stream. From a hotel in D.C., surrounded by two plainclothes federal agents tasked with escorting him to the Senate subcommittee hearing later that day. He leaned forward, transfixed, whispering to himself, "She's not dodging it, she's dragging the whole machine into the light." In the live feed, a reporter asked Ms. Markle, "Are you suggesting the royal family knowingly placed you into geopolitical operations?" "I'm saying the royal family benefited from relationships they didn't fully understand," she replied. "And when I tried to ask questions, I was told I was naive." That's when I stopped asking. The interview concluded with a closing statement that would be replayed for days. "I may never undo what I enabled, but I can show you how it was built, so we don't build it again." The screen faded to black, but the silence didn't last. Within minutes, 3 nations, Germany, Kenya, and Canada, all for a full UN tribunal into Halcyon. MI6 publicly denied all allegations, but quietly moved 5 senior agents into undisclosed assignments. In the U.S., a bipartisan group of senators called for an independent investigation into data-sharing deals between tech firms and foreign allies under the pretext of humanitarian aid. And somewhere in Zurich, Lena Baines watched from a dim hotel room as her own investigation finally got the traction it needed. Her next article would blow open the next tier of the operation. Nairobi, a different summit, a different identity, a different face, but the same architecture of silence. Meanwhile, Meghan sat alone in the aftermath. No team, no PR buffer. Just her and the knowledge that telling the truth had changed nothing and everything at once. Maria approached her after the feed had ended, holding a small envelope someone had slipped her during the conference. "There's one more file," Maria said. It was hand-delivered. No name. Meghan opened it slowly. Inside was a photo taken from what looked like a drone hovering over a private island compound. A figure stood on a balcony, face turned away but unmistakably Stephen Colbert. Written on the back in ink. He wasn't just watching. He was building something. Meghan looked up, eyes hard. This wasn't the end. It was just the point where the mask dropped for everyone. The storm moved across borders faster than any aircraft. What Meghan had said in her live testimony didn't just fracture old alliances, it cracked open a global fault line. Governments weren't just reacting, they were scrambling. The British Parliament announced a special hearing into the Crown's soft power diplomacy practices. The U.S. Senate accelerated Colbert's closed-door testimony, and the United Nations called for an emergency assembly that would, for the first time in its history, allow non-state actors like Lena Baines and Maria Vasquez to present evidence alongside member nations. Geneva had become the world's courtroom. But this wasn't about protocols anymore. This was personal. For Meghan, for Colbert, for everyone who had worn a mask in the theater of humanitarian politics. At the center of it now was the envelope. Meghan had received a single drone photograph showing Stephen Colbert on a private island. Face turned away, accompanied by a message in handwritten ink. He wasn't just watching. He was building something. The photo was dated 3 months before the View episode. Colbert had denied any prior contact with intelligence sources, but that image suggested otherwise. Meghan stared at the timestamp again and again. March 18th, 3 weeks before her appearance was booked. 1 month before Halcyon was first mentioned on air. In a cold office in Zurich, Lena Baines was racing against time. Her investigation had taken her deep into financial corridors where foundations blurred into state-run surveillance initiatives. Halcyon, it turned out, was only the code name for the operational front. The real system was a layered architecture called Marauder Digital Infrastructure, built to collect biometric and behavioral data from conflict zones, refugee populations, and even humanitarian staff. The kicker: its servers were hosted by a private firm funded by a venture capital group tied directly to Stephen Colbert's charitable trust. Lena couldn't believe it. Colbert hadn't just stumbled upon Halcyon. He'd been tracking it for years, possibly investing in it from the edges, waiting for the right moment to torch it publicly. The island photo wasn't proof of guilt, it was proof of proximity. And Meghan had been the match. In Washington, Colbert walked into the subcommittee hearing with his usual quiet defiance. But gone was the irony, gone was the smile. He sat down, took the oath, and answered each question with surgical precision. Mr. Colbert, one senator asked, "Were you aware of Ms. Markle's diplomatic involvement in Geneva before you received those documents?" "I was aware of the rumors," he said. "But I had no physical evidence until days before the segment aired. And those documents? They came in an unmarked envelope. No return address, no source confirmation, and the photo of you on Zana Island." Colbert paused. "That's a private property owned by a media donor. I was there for a retreat. I never discussed Halcyon with anyone on that island." The room tense. Senator Halverson leaned forward. "You're telling us that you were given the biggest international leak in modern diplomatic history, moments before confronting a royal figure on live television, and you didn't vet the source?" "I verified the data," Colbert said, "not the messenger." Outside the chamber, protesters had returned. Some chanted for Meghan to be extradited to the UK for questioning. Others held signs reading, "Free the Truth." At the heart of the crowd stood a man in sunglasses, watching silently, holding no sign. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't filming. But when Lena passed by on her way to her hotel, he pressed a small package into her hand and disappeared into the crowd. Inside was a flash drive. No label. Lena returned to her room, locked the door, and plugged it in. The files were raw unedited video footage from the Geneva summit. Not just the room Meghan sat in, but the ones next door. MI6 agents exchanging encrypted files. African leaders holding side meetings with private tech contractors. And one room 411 where Meghan was seen receiving a tablet from a man who was later identified as Edward Langston in the video. Langston says, "When the time comes, you'll know who to trust, but not until then." Lena paused the video. Something was off. Langston had claimed Meghan was only useful as cover, but this moment felt rehearsed, almost prophetic, as if someone had always known the structure would collapse. And then came the final video. Colbert again. This time, not on the island. This time, at a London cafe. He was in tea alone. Across from him sat a woman with a royal protection badge barely concealed beneath her coat. The final files dropped at 2:14 a.m. Geneva time. Encrypted torrents spread like wildfire across dark web channels, bypassing firewalls, triggering government lockdowns, and crashing 3 international intelligence servers within the first 10 minutes. Grey Ribbon had done what no state actor dared: publish the architect's dossier. Inside it, names, locations, payment trails, and high-definition surveillance footage capturing years of covert meetings. The narrative that had spun in rumors, in live interviews, in courtroom whispers was now carved into fact. At the top of the dossier's organizational map was the logo of Marauder. Below it, 7 key nodes: political figures, media personalities, tech barons. And right at the center, 2 names circled in red: M. Stroud S. Colbert. When Meghan saw the files, she sat frozen in a dim farmhouse outside Lyon, where she'd been moved after threats escalated to a credible assassination warning. Maria Vasquez sat across from her, pale and sleepless. Neither of them spoke at first. The footage had done more than reveal the meetings. It exposed the construction of a geopolitical stage where image was weaponized, and narrative control had been the true endgame. In one video, Meghan could be seen on a private jet seated beside Edward Langston, reading a leather-bound binder labeled Soft Asset Redeployment Framework. She wasn't being forced. She wasn't unaware. She was nodding, highlighting passages, asking pointed questions about African NGO press leverage and EU tech liaisons. Another file showed Colbert in a Manhattan townhouse 3 years earlier, laughing quietly as a strategist from a media intelligence firm explained how emotional fatigue could be weaponized to turn humanitarian icons into distraction beacons. The more the public fixates on her, the strategist said, the more we can slide legislation under their noses. And Colbert, he raised a glass. Then, let's make her loud. Meghan stood abruptly. Her hands were shaking. This isn't. It's not the full story. No, Maria said softly. But it's enough. In Washington, Colbert's lawyer was already on the phone with federal investigators. Leaked audio clips had revealed conversations that contradicted his sworn testimony. The same senator who had questioned him about the island retreat was now calling for charges of perjury and foreign collusion. Colbert hadn't just exposed Halsey, he had possibly manufactured the scandal's timing to elevate his political leverage. One file even suggested he was in early-stage talks for a media commissioner role in a yet-to-be-announced international human rights watchdog panel backed by 3 nations with interests in dissolving traditional UN authority. He wasn't just a participant anymore. He was an architect. By noon that day, 5 major news networks cut into live coverage as Lena Baines stood outside the Palais des Nations in a rainstorm, holding a flash drive. Her statement was brief. Journalism was supposed to reveal the story, but today, we are the story. What you're about to read is the map of modern manipulation. Every face you've trusted, every headline you've questioned. It was all rehearsed. And it begins and ends with 2 people who learned to play truth like a symphony. The flash drive was uploaded to the global UN press server an hour later. Inside, the full release were 4,000 recordings of internal rehearsals for soft confrontation programming segments, constructed to appear organic but designed to trigger emotional implosions on camera. Meghan's View appearance had been one of them. The entire panel had been briefed days in advance. The spontaneous moment with Joy Behar had been timed to the second. The surprise entrance by Colbert, approved and choreographed in an earlier production meeting using psychological triggers designed to provoke Meghan into silence. It had worked, and yet no one had anticipated the fallout. That evening, a joint tribunal was announced between the International Criminal Court and the UN Assembly's ethics arm. It would examine not just covert diplomatic abuse, but the manipulation of public consciousness through entertainment, media, and celebrity. Meghan Markle received a sealed summons to appear not as a defendant, Not yet, but as a critical witness. In the construction of narrative warfare, she stood at the edge of a river near the farmhouse, holding the envelope as dusk fell. Maria joined her, silent. "Do you think they'll forgive me?" Meghan asked, voice barely audible. Maria looked away. "The question isn't whether they'll forgive you," turned toward her. "It's whether they'll ever believe anything." Again, far away in an anonymous room, Stephen Colbert stared at a live broadcast of Lena's speech. Alone, the smile was gone. The mask had slipped, the game was over, and the truth had no heroes left.